Hello, this is Dr. Carol Brown from East Carolina University, and I am here today to tell you all about storytelling as narrative nonfiction and the hunt for fake news in our world. I think these are some pretty important uh, topics for students in 2020, and I think it's going to give you some good ideas for classroom activities for middle school and secondary level students. You can see on the home page, I've got a link to ECU, where I am Professor Emerita and currently teaching classes in the library science program. There's also a link to this slide presentation and a link to the handout, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Okay, narrative nonfiction. It's the same thing as creative nonfiction, but I'll usually refer to the term narrative nonfiction because when this assignment was first given, it was 2 years ago, and the research behind this presentation referred to the types of reporting known as narrative nonfiction. And actually, narrative nonfiction is the fastest growing genre in the publishing industry today. You ask why? Well, when I tell you what it is, it'll probably give you an answer to the why of why it is it's growing so quickly and its importance in our school systems. Narrative nonfiction. Well, the information explosion, of course, and the knowledge economy is important. We just have to know a lot more, and we have to know more and more every day in our lives and in the schools and in the workplace. Take, for example, the coronavirus. A year ago, we didn't even know what COVID-19 is. We didn't know the virus that caused it. And as scientists are doing more and more work and research, and as they're writing and reporting on their work, then it's just more and more information. That's just a little tiny example of all the information that has exploded over the last 20 years. So narrative nonfiction is important because of the expanse of information. Now, the other thing about narrative nonfiction is important is because it is a story and it is related to storytelling. And storytelling is important because, for one thing, it began at least 4,000 years ago, and it was used to communicate important cultural, religious, and social beliefs. People didn't have word processing, they didn't even have pen and paper. And so they had to tell about these things through story. Many of the stories that we read today are true and accurate based on those very early stories. They might be changed a little, but the basis began in narrative nonfiction, true stories. Today, we know that doctors, engineers, counselors, small business owners, they all need to tell their story. They need to be able to tell their story. This wasn't always recognized in education. A few years ago, colleges and universities began to include a creative writing course as a requirement in engineering programs. And this was because engineers, really, many of them went out into the workplace and they weren't able to explain certain important facets of their profession so that the layperson could understand. They didn't know how to tell their story. And so people need to learn to tell their story. Here's another example. A medical doctor. Many times a doctor might be meeting with a patient, urging them to, let's say, give up tobacco. Well, you hear that until it becomes, in one ear and out the other. But if a doctor tells a compelling story about the suffering of a patient who refused to give up tobacco, that person's going to remember it better. They're going to remember the facts. They're going to remember the impact of tar and nicotine on their lungs through story. So storytelling is important for the professions. The power of story and how it impacts on facts. People remember facts when they're embedded in a story. If you read through a list of important facts related to, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's just say, let's go back to forest fires in California. If you read about the causes of forest fires, if you read about the damage that comes from forest fires, if you read about the financial cost of forest fires, you probably won't remember those facts beyond the moment of the reporting. But if the report is told in a story, you're probably going to remember the facts longer and understand them better. People are more easily persuaded through story. Many a preacher has used a story to persuade an audience to accept and understand a certain moral lesson. People are persuaded to do what the storyteller would like for them to do. And that's all right. That's a good thing, because sometimes we need to be persuaded about certain things, and the story can do that. Memoirs are a good way to build and enrich relationships. If you've ever been a part of a writing group where people share their memoirs, you'll learn that over time, say by the end of a semester, people become closely bonded. They become good friends because of that sharing of memoirs. And at the end, let me say the importance of the elements of story. A good story will have all the elements of any story. A narrative nonfiction will have a setting, it'll have characters, plot, a problem, and resolution. These are important when you're teaching children about narrative nonfiction, that they understand in writing a narrative nonfiction report to make sure those different story elements are included. Now, the research behind this presentation is based on the 3 R's, and this was based on the work and research of Richard Gutkind. He's a professor at Arizona State University. If he's not already retired, he's been doing this work for many, many years, and he has looked at narrative nonfiction, how to write it, how to evaluate it, how to analyze it. And he has given us a framework to use with students to do these things, especially in evaluating the narrative nonfiction. The 3 R's are the research, real world connections, and review of facts with fact checking. In the research part, you're always going to get the backstory. You need the hard, cold facts that come from the primary sources. And in the real world connection, you need to connect to the heart and soul of the listener or the reader. This is what engages them so that you'll keep their attention. It brings tears, laughter, even rage. But the real world connection is an important part of narrative nonfiction. And then the fact checking part, students need to be able to know how to go back to sources. They need to know the process for checking reliability. What does reliability mean? What are the steps involved in checking the reliability of a certain report? Here's an example of a narrative nonfiction report. It's given by an anthropologist, and he's done his work in northern Pakistan. Now, if he were to tell you about his work in science and anthropology, you'd be bored to death probably hearing about the white leopard and the background of the white leopard and how the white leopard eats the herds. And if you told that in a report, it would be hard to keep the attention of your audience. But this man gives it in a story format. There is a setting in northern Pakistan. There are characters, and these are the herdsmen that live there. There's a plot. The white leopard eats the herd, and the herdsmen kill the white leopard. What's the problem? How can the anthropologists work out some kind of partnership so that the white leopard has food to survive and the herdsmen are able to preserve their herds for food and livelihood? And he goes on to give his resolution in this. And you'll have to listen closely. I'm not sure you can hear him as well. He does have a bit of an accent, but he speaks about drinking water from streams, eating half-cooked meat. He's moved in with the natives, and that's how he's learned about the problem of the white leopard and the herdsman. So watch this short clip.
Why snow leopards, and why and how did I start this project? I started this project in 1999. And before that, I worked in northern Pakistan, which is where most of the snow leopards are found. And the objective of this action research project is to resolve the conflict between local farmers and snow leopards. Snow leopards kill domestic livestock of local farmers. Local farmers retaliate and kill snow leopard using various methods, such as shooting, poisoning, laying leg traps. So this project that I work on tries to resolve this conflict by compensating farmers for their losses from snow leopard predation. And in return, we take commitment from the farmers to leave the snow leopard alone. It's hard, the surveys and trekking, it's very strenuous. You have to like camp life. You have to be able to drink water from a stream, eat the dodgy and questionable, herbs that local people offer you while you're on the trek. Eat half-cooked meat. And as an anthropologist, these are not just ways of adjusting to the field conditions, but it's also a way of showing respect to the local people, that you are with them, you appreciate their lifestyle, and you participate in that, and you act out what they do and what they think you should do.
All right, I'm going to stop here. That he's nearly finished in this report, but I think it's fascinating how he turns this report into a story about the herdsman in northern Pakistan. So let's go back to where we were. And on the next slide now, let's look again at what a good story is. We just saw go back just a moment here. Okay. We want to look at what a good story is. This Mr. Hussein, Dr. Hussein, I think his name was, he did tell a good story. And so if students were to write their own narrative nonfiction, we want to look at what is a good story. It's entertaining, it's enjoyable. If it's not, people are not going to listen or view or read that story. They simply are not. We have too much information to read these days or view or listen to. So it's got to be interesting and entertaining. And when he told the details about living in living with the natives, that was very interesting to me, eating half-cooked meat and drinking water from the stream. I thought that was interesting, but it's got to be interesting to the reader or the viewer. And then all the scenes in the story must connect together for one big story. And one of the best examples of this is Ken Burns. If you watch Ken Burns' videos, his stories, he takes all these different parts and brings them together so that there's a big idea at the end of the viewing. So that's an important characteristic of a well-prepared narrative nonfiction. Gutkind says that stories are sharing ideas with boots on the ground. And if you watch even one of Ken Burns' movies, they're available on PBS, if you watch even one, you can feel your feet in those boots on the ground, no matter what his story is. So those are the characteristics of a good story. And this is what you would want to guide your students to be able to do. Now, let's go back I'm going to tie this in now to the standards. And we're using the AASL standards, and this is from the standards framework. And there are 3 main standards and their competencies that are very well covered with this use of narrative nonfiction in the classroom. The first one is that learners engage with new knowledge by following a process that includes use of evidence. Well, clearly, if you are either writing narrative nonfiction or if you're reading and viewing and evaluating, you are gathering and engaging in new knowledge for inquiry purposes. And you're investigating to answer a question. The second standard relates to learners participate in an ongoing inquiry process. Now look at the 4 steps and think about how this might apply to the narrative nonfiction. You're continually seeking knowledge. You're engaged in sustained inquiry. You're enacting new understanding through real-world connections, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And you're using reflection to guide informed decisions. When you're evaluating a narrative nonfiction, clearly you're in an inquiry type learning experience. You're making real-world connections because a well-prepared narrative nonfiction always connects to the real world. It's going to be heart-wrenching. It's going to cause humor. It may cause rage, but a well-written or well-presented and produced narrative nonfiction connects to the real heart and soul of people. And then in the reflective writing part, that's needed to validate the fact-checking. You need to reflect on what you viewed or read to determine validity and accuracy. And then the third one, back here, the third one is learners act on information they need by determining the need to gather information, looking at possible sources, and making critical choices about those information sources. The 3 R's framework is perfect for that because you know you need to research to get basic facts. You know you need to look at these possible sources to gather your information. And you know you need to evaluate and make good choices on what's going to be valid for fact-checking. So you can see how this inquiry-based narrative nonfiction activity very clearly supports these 3 standards. Mary Virginia Bunker is a kindergarten teacher in the mountains of North Carolina. She's been teaching kindergarten for over 30 years. But she doesn't just teach ABCs and shapes and colors. She uses a very innovative teaching method that requires critical thinking through the use of primary source images. Note I said primary source images. And because those little guys in kindergarten probably are not doing a lot of reading, but she teaches critical thinking through images. She was enrolled in the graduate course Digital Literacy, and her project was to review several narrative nonfictions and answer a research question related to that narrative nonfiction. Her question was, how did Malala's acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize advocate and serve the needs of others? To do this project, she, along with all the other students in that class, they had to read or view similar or same narrative stories. She chose a story about Malala. There were several different topics used, and so it made for a very interesting project for me. But she chose Malala, and she used 4 different news sources. And in her comparison, she learned more about the Nobel Peace Prize and Malala, and how Malala serves education and the lives of young girls in Pakistan. She learned more than I think she ever thought she would learn. All right, let's begin with the first review, the CNN. How and why was Malala selected for the Nobel Peace Prize? The original report, narrative nonfiction report, is included on each slide, and this one goes directly to CNN. The template that was used to make these analyses includes the 3 R's. And so students would write their reflections, their analysis, and their summaries and plug it into a template with these 3 headings: research, real world, and review for fact checking. For CNN, the original inquiry for the report begins with Malala's life as an 11-year-old girl whose father was determined that she would become an advocate for girls in education. Now, it's interesting, and I viewed as much of this as I could, but her father actually owned a private school in northern Pakistan, and he started out with just a few students, but it was such a good school, and the need and the desire was so great. Pretty soon, the school was just filled to capacity with young students. And so he, being the innovator that he was, and his political mind caused him to encourage his daughter to pursue advocacy for education. And even as a young girl of 11 years old, you can hear her saying she wants to become a doctor and she needs an education for that. So the videos and the background story are included in the research for this report. Then the real world connection. After and even before Malala gets the Nobel Peace Prize, she uses technology to promote education for girls in Pakistan and other nations. And she does a lot of talking online through different technology sources and technology platforms. And so she began this as a young girl and continued. And these statements and speeches and comments touch the hearts of people outside Pakistan. They want to donate to help with the schools. And they also cause a lot of ire and anger from opposing forces. And that's what led to her attempted assassination. Then reviewing the fact checking. The original story is the actual speech of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. It's the committee members themselves who tell about the background of Malala and their reasons for selecting her as for the award. And so it clearly is grounded in primary source video, primary source information. Now let's look at MSNBC. Again, you'll see the link to the original story. The research began again with Malala as an 11-year-old child. And there are quotes throughout this analysis. In quote marks and in italics is Mary Bunker's commentary in her analysis. The political realities of the Taliban, the abuses against women, the poverty, and the discrimination against girls being educated have been documented by a variety of humanitarian watch groups, such as the Human Rights Watch. And Mary goes on to finish that statement, that commentary in the research part and the facts behind this story. Real world. There is multimedia footage of Malala in her younger life, and her comments and her interviews in those early videos. And it is amazing, really, that we have the videos of her as a young girl with her father and other family members, how that connects to her speech when she accepts the award from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. This particular report was produced and directed by Adam Ellick, and he is an award-winning New York Times videographer. And so that is how it connects to the real world. Fact-checking, Adam Ellick has a very strong reputation for accurate work, and he's produced many, many films based on Malala's life, beginning in 2009. So it's easy to check back the accuracy of the information of this one report when you cross-check it with earlier reports by Adam Ellick. In the PBS NewsHour, this analysis is a little bit longer because the information was more detailed. And if you watch PBS, you know that they do a lot of background research. For this particular report, there was the news correspondent was a lady, Miss Lemon was her name, and she has a rather amazing background too in the work she's done over a number of years for humanitarian rights and humanitarian grievances. The report also includes clippage, video footage from the Nobel Peace Prize platform. And it is interesting, a lot of people may not know, but it was a double award. Two people, one was a Hindu man and the other was a Muslim woman, Malala. And so in the report, there is commentary on the differences between these two recipients, personally, socially, culturally, the differences. Real world, there is a comment in this particular report that touches everyone. This was, of course, after she was shot in the face. And the comment she made during her acceptance speech was, I could remain silent and wait to be killed, or I could speak up and then be killed. I chose to speak up. And so those kinds of comments make Malala internationally known advocate for a lot of different causes. And so that connects to the real world. For fact-checking, Mary identifies the credentials of the news correspondent, Ms. Lemon, and her many years of experience in the Middle East and the many reports she's made on the social and cultural life in the Middle East. She's done a lot of work on studying child marriage and some of the humanitarian concerns that connect to that. And so Mary identifies Miss Lemon's reputation and background and earlier work as a credible source for this particular report. Last, let's look at, let me go forward here. Fox News. This was the fourth narrative nonfiction. The link is there that you can click on and view the report. The research behind this was a report with the narrative was actually reported by Shepard Smith. His commentary, and he is a Fox News correspondent and actually a kind of a TV personality. His report include actual video footage of the Nobel Peace Prize award, but much of his commentary was subjective. He minimized the importance of Malala's story, but emphasized another angle of the story, the injustices of the Taliban and indiscriminate killings of people outside the Islamic faith. And while this does certainly connect with Malala's story, it's not her main emphasis, her main focus in receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. For the real world connection, Mr. Smith was, if you'll listen to his report, he seemed slightly flippant and disrespectful of Malala and her family. And I will have to say, now this was the evaluation and assessment of Mary, but anyone who has watched Shepard Smith on Fox News could say this was simply his presentation style, and perhaps being flippant was not intended, but he does focus on things that seem secondary to the main story. In fact checking, as I said, he does include clippage, video footage from the Nobel Peace Prize presentation, and that adds credibility to the report, but his emphasis was on other things, including the importance of children in the United States finishing their education. And so that is really a very indirect connection to what Malala is saying about the needs and concerns in developing countries. If you go to the handout, you'll see the full assignment, the full report and analysis by Mary Bunker. You'll also see the template that I had prepared, designed, and presented to the students so that they could do this analysis. The objective for this presentation was to inform teachers and other specialists in the best practices in use of narrative nonfiction for teaching critical thinking in 21st century media, and whether it's text media or motion media. So I hope this is valuable for you. The handout, the reading of it, is a lot of information there. It could get tedious, but there are links to the reports and a lot of video footage that over time you may find very valuable. The research citations are embedded throughout the various slides. The images all come from picabee.com. And this presentation is the work of myself, Dr. Carol Brown, with East Carolina University. I hope this is useful for you and your students.